This show was previously broadcast live on ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com.
Welcome to another edition of Expanding Minds, where we are exploring the culture of consciousness. And today we're going to be talking to Richard Smoley about consciousness. His new book is called The Dice Game of Shiva, How Consciousness Creates the Universe. But it's really about this fundamental question of the relationship, of course, of consciousness to the universe, to the world we experience, to the cosmos, material reality, psychological reality, our own experience. And of course, there's many different perspectives on this fundamental question, which is something that we all have to work out on our own as well. You know, on the one hand, we have the scientific materialist model, which at its most extreme would say that consciousness, this soup we swim in continuously through dreams and experiences, waking, sleeping, the whole thing, that all of that conscious experience is sort of an epiphenomenon, they say, or a kind of echo of the brain inside an animal body that evolved in a material cosmos within which consciousness is sort of like a little flickering flame that occasionally happens to complex material systems. And there's a lot of interest in that perspective. It's a popular one amongst a lot of researchers and neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists and technologists. It's a very important view to understand if one is going to grapple with the state of consciousness today, with the culture of consciousness today. It's one of the claims that underlies these discussions. And on the other hand, you have a whole variety of more spiritual, mystical, metaphysical views that insist that at root the material universe, our experience, the fabric of reality as we perceive it, are all expressions or creations or manifestations of a more fundamental level of consciousness, whether that consciousness is seen as the mind of God or in a more impersonal sense as a kind of universal field, a sort of basic identity that we share perhaps with other conscious beings, perhaps with all things. And this view manifests itself not just in traditional mystical or religious ideas, but in a number of transpersonal ideas about psychology. And so it's also incredibly important to take this consciousness is all perspective as well. But if both these views are important, and in fact I would say that anybody grappling with the issue of consciousness today cannot help but engage both these views as well as a myriad of views in between. But if you take these two extremes, you realize that not only are you thinking about the possibility that consciousness is merely an expression of our marvelous material animal bodies, or that consciousness underlies all experience, that it's the relationship between those two possibilities that's also extremely important. How do we navigate between them? At what time and what point is it important to pay attention to neuroscience and important to pay attention to the phenomenology of the brain, what we're understanding about evolution and its effects on our psychology? And on the other hand, how do we account for this marvelous, open-ended, constantly evolving and expanding realm of consciousness itself? What is the relationship between these two realms, between mind and matter, if you will? And I think Richard's going to help us navigate some of this tricky space. I'm wondering, what do you think, Maja? I want to bring on Maja Dau, our esoteric librarian here at Expanding Mind. Do you think that consciousness underlies all things at the end?
I really do. I'm kind of a panpsychist myself. I think that consciousness is inextricably bound up in this world of matter, and I just have always felt that way innately. Like, I read a lot about all the discussions that philosophers and scientists have about it, but, I mean, when I break it down at the end of the day, I do relate it to my experience and my own feeling. And I know that, lots of people say, oh, you can't, your experience is subjective and that doesn't mean anything, but I don't know, that's just kind of how I do it. But I really like that whole idea, behind the influence of consciousness, right, on the material world. I mean, that's like the basis of most religions and magic and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, what is that relationship that you were talking about, the relationship of consciousness and how we navigate and its kind of role in how the world even is, like you said, like created or manifested, and it's that whole shaman dreaming the world into being thing, that pervades most ancient stories. So for me personally, yeah, I think that's the ticket right there, is that consciousness is everywhere.
Well, it's also a very practical question. That's the thing, is that even though these conversations can seem pretty abstruse and theoretical, they really have a direct bearing on how we experience our lives. Because if you take seriously the scientific account, or the more materialist account, I should say, then you have that fundamental idea that your own experience is just not that important. So, like, even in the midst of your unfolding experience of dealing with your dream states, of dealing with extraordinary phenomena that happen to a lot of us, trying to understand how we can connect with other people, what are these intuitive connections we have with the world, with animals, with lovers, all this stuff that happens at the back of your mind, you go, well, what does that all really mean?
I know.
Scientists really know. They're the ones who actually have an idea what's going on. This is all just fluff on top of this meat machine. And that's an underlying assumption for a lot of modern people, and they're not even necessarily aware of it, but it has a tremendous impact on how you actually experience
everything.
Yeah. So that's why I think these ideas are really important to contemplate, not just because they're fascinating and because they go to the root of the big questions, but also because it makes you aware, just as you go through your day, about how your different assumptions about reality shape your experience and the different qualities of your experience, and what things come forward and what things step away. Because, alternately, by ignoring the scientific model, ignoring the insights of neuroscience, I think we also can do ourselves a disservice, because we end up taking responsibility or thinking that things in our experience and our minds are our fault, when actually, if you look at them from another perspective, you recognize that there are all these other biological forces and evolutionary forces that are working through us. So it also is a step towards wisdom to integrate this.
That's right, and unification with the rest of the universe, because you get put outside of yourself as a cause.
Exactly. Well, I'd like to bring on Richard Smoley. I've known Richard for many, many years, back to when he was an editor at Gnosis magazine, where I used to write a great deal in the 1990s. And since then, he's written a number of marvelous books. He's one of my favorite writers on spiritual and esoteric matters. He's written on esoteric Christianity, Gnosticism, conscious love, and a bunch of other topics. And his new book is The Dice Game of Shiva, How Consciousness Creates the Universe. Richard, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, Erik.
That's great. So, listen, you have written a very interesting collection of books, and there is definitely some threads that are running through them. And I'd love to, before we jump into the dice game, for you maybe to set up for our listeners a little bit of the context of where you were coming from before you wrote this book, in terms of the things you've been developing in your last couple of books about esoteric Christianity, Gnosticism, and other things.
Well, yeah, I started, as you say, working as editor of Gnosis for a number of years, and my boss and colleague Jay Kinney and I wrote a book called Hidden Wisdom, which is a guide to the Western inner traditions that Gnosis covered. And then I went on to explore other facets of the Western inner traditions, particularly esoteric Christianity, largely because Christianity is so central to our civilization, and I felt the more mystical and esoteric aspects of it had been given short shrift and either dealt with, generally speaking, obscurely or unintelligently or both. So then, I wrote a book called Inner Christianity, which I teased out the threads of what I feel the central teaching of the Christian tradition behind all the symbolism is, and a history of that tradition called Forbidden Faith, and other aspects of it, including, as you say, conscious love, which is one of the central teachings of Christianity. Now, in this whole thread of ideas and explorations, one kind of fundamental principle became more and more clear to me, and esoteric Christianity refers to it sometimes as the kingdom of heaven, or the I, or I am, versus the world. And this polarity is in everything. And to relate it to the Dice Game of Shiva, which is the latest book, and which uses some more Eastern terminology in this than I had in my previous works. Going back to this question of what is consciousness, and if you read a fair amount about consciousness, you'll find that it's either very vaguely defined, consciousness is like a computer, which tells you absolutely nothing, or it's defined in very circular terms. What is consciousness? Well, it's awareness. What's that? Well, it's perception. Well, then what's that? Well, it's consciousness. So you can read a great deal, even there are these, books with pretentious titles like Consciousness Explained that would be all very well if they actually did what they were advertising. And the Dice Game of Shiva starts with a very simple and, I think, at the same time, very fertile definition of consciousness, which is that consciousness is the capacity to relate self and other. If you don't have something like this, it's very hard to speak of consciousness in any sort of sense. Now, to be aware myself, conscious now, has something to do, at least with my being aware myself, talking on the phone on a radio interview. Even in dreaming, there a kind of consciousness persists, and that there is a self in the dream, sometimes rather imperfectly distinguished from the other characters, but still there nonetheless. And even in dreamless sleep, which some of the Hindu mystics say is the closest state to enlightenment, paradoxically perhaps, there's still a sense of self and other. I mean, what, after all, is the most universally prescribed remedy for anything? Well, one of them is certainly sleep. And sleep, getting rest, enables the self of the body to fight off the other of the pathogens. It's not consciousness in the customary view of that term, but it's still consciousness of a kind.
Well, one of the things I really like about your approach with self and other is, like you say, is that on the one hand, it's very simple, and it's something we can all relate to immediately, but it also allows the definition of consciousness to expand, as you say, to include states that most of us wouldn't think of as being conscious, like this whatever mind is operative in deep sleep, and what other mind is operative in other kinds of creatures, other kinds of possibilities of consciousness. But by emphasizing this relationship of self and other, you really highlight how consciousness is relational. It's embedded. It is engaged. It's not just sitting there. Like, I think sometimes especially from the New Age side and from Eastern lore, we get this idea of consciousness as just this kind of, infinite field of custard, I think that Timothy Leary called it. And we lose that sense of consciousness being always engaged. And that feels really dynamic to me as a way to proceed.
Yeah. And the other aspect of this is that it brings up a facet of the subject that is often overlooked or lost. One of the great conundrums of consciousness, as as discussed these days in many fields, including everything from neurology to philosophy to psychology, is that human consciousness is, as you said in your introduction, a kind of epiphenomenon or side effect of these material processes which have produced consciousness in some sort of way that nobody has ever managed to explain, although they keep insisting that they will do this soon, any day now. So human consciousness is, by this view, very unorganically attached to the rest of the universe. It's either an accident or a mystery or both. If, however, you view consciousness as the capacity to relate self and other in some sort of fundamental sense, suddenly you realize this principle is embedded in everything. We can certainly see that animals have this capacity. Plants do to what seem to be a more rudimentary degree. And even in the inanimate world, supposedly unconscious or lifeless, something like this must exist, because after all, a hydrogen atom must have some capacity to recognize, however unlike our own it may be, it must have this capacity to recognize, say, an oxygen atom and react with it under certain circumstances to produce water or whatever you like. So taking this view of consciousness that I've tried to spell out here enables us to see that it's organic to everything, and that human consciousness is not radically divorced from the rest of the universe, but an integral part of it, as you say, engaged in it. This may be disheartening in removing some of that human sense of privilege and uniqueness that the human race so kind of desperately clings to, but it has the consolation of making us feel more, as you say, engaged and embedded in the universe as a whole.
Well, it's true, and one of the things that I like, that you do by setting these parameters about an engagement of the self and the other is that some people might think that defines you as separate from the other, that consciousness makes, this little bubble around what is you, but in fact you get into that notion of conscious exploration of what is the I, and how, like in Buddhism and stuff, that actually tends to have the effect of allowing you to totally engage with the other and then identify yourself with a kind of selflessness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that raises a lot of kind of very rich questions, one of which is none of us, of course, is absolutely a self or another.
Right.
Which, and if, as you say, if we were, we would be kind of radically cut off, and you'd end up with solipsism. The idea that only I'm the only real person. Everything else is just like a phenomenon in my head, which no serious philosopher has ever really tried to defend.
Totally.
But if you view the fact that, you're a self and there's another out there, but these principles are constantly working. You're another to someone else. You're an experiencer and an experienced as well. Then you see this interplay, and it's symbolized in many forms. The constant interplay of the yang and the yin in Chinese philosophy is an obvious example, but there are certainly many others as well.
Well, let's talk about the main one that you use as your organizing metaphor for the book, the Dice Game of Shiva. What is the Dice Game of Shiva?
Well, it's a myth. It's very curious. It's a myth in which Shiva and his consort Parvati are locked in this, start out being locked in this embrace of eternal lovemaking. And then this rather sinister yogi named Narada shows up and says, I can show you something even more fun than that. And he teaches them what is basically, I suppose, a primitive form of Parcheesi. Remember Parcheesi? And they get involved in this game, and curiously enough, Shiva always loses Parvati. I mean, it seems very weird that the god Shiva, the Lord of the universe, in terms of Hindu thought, should lose at this game and lose so consistently. And eventually he loses all his attributes. And then he said, well, that's all right. I'm going to just go off and live the life of an ascetic in the woods. And eventually Parvati kind of gets him back, and the story goes on. But this says a little bit about the dynamics between consciousness and its experience, self and other. There's always something that experiences, and there's always something that is experienced, right? Now, whatever you can see, whatever you experience, suddenly immediately becomes other. And that's symbolized by Parvati, who is, there are lots of names for this. In Hindu thought, it's Prakriti, which means something often translated as nature, but it really goes far beyond that. And consciousness, whenever it perceives something, it immediately loses in the sense that it's no longer itself. And it becomes kind of bewitched by its own experience. On the other hand, it doesn't really make any difference because, shall we say, consciousness in its pure form, is immortal and indestructible. And that in you which sees, that in you which is kind of, shall we say, purely aware, is never going to die. All its attributes may eventually go. When you die, your body's going to go, and even maybe a lot of what you think of as you is going to go. Are you going to be a Republican or a Democrat when you die? Are you going to be worried about, your rent or your mortgage? The minute the body dies, a lot of that goes with it. But still, there's something that is aware that remains, and the Hindus call this Atman, or self. The Buddhists, taking exactly the same thing and drawing exactly the opposite conclusion from it, say it is no self. Well, it isn't self in any kind of, sense we ordinarily attach to that term, but there is kind of this awareness, this eye that looks out at the world through you as through a telescope.
Well, I was really, really pleased to see that you dealt with this material in this book because, and without going into more, technical background, that one of the underlying philosophical traditions that's implied in this view is the Samkhya, one of the classical Hindu philosophies that I myself have always found incredibly attractive, one of the most attractive models out there. And there's something about, again, it's almost like the definition of consciousness that you start out with, where it's very simple, but within that simplicity so much is implied, that once you really accept or allow for something in consciousness, even in our own mind, not the Atman we might experience in our peak meditation or the no self we finally realize after 30 years of Zen meditation, but right now in our own experience, in our own awareness, there's an element, a sensitivity, a pliability that is pure, that's empty. Not pure as in like pure holy, but just empty, without attributes, without anything identified with it, no identification. And everything that arises, experiences of self, of identity, ideas, all the experiences of the world are in some sense everything else. And it's a tapestry that's inside as well as outside. And to me, that model it opens up so much because it kind of It speaks to where we already are, because you can see that in your own life. Like, an example is the way that we try to ground ourselves by identifying with things. It's like, I'm a Republican. It feels like you're getting to really close. Like, if you get right down to it, I'm a tragic romantic. That's my core personality, and I can see the way my whole life I'm in. But as soon as you start to reflect on
romantic.
What's that?
You're a total tragic romantic.
I am a total tragic romantic, it's true. Now everybody knows. But nonetheless, it's not really me. And once even these very internal personality-oriented things are acknowledged and identified and named, then there's this gap. There's always this gap that emerges with perception and awareness. And so it's a philosophical or a mystical model that, to my mind, speaks very directly to the just everyday experience of consciousness, and I'm really happy that you focused in on it, because people don't talk about it that much in my experience.
Yeah, and that's all, I think, extremely well put. I used to be a tragic romantic myself until I realized that no one really cared that much, so I became an observer, but that's another story. But yeah, I mean, you put that, extremely well and extremely eloquently. And you're quite right in that the identification with all these roles you play, or these thoughts or feelings you have, are a way of kind of creating a kind of fictitious identity, because to be just purely aware, purely cognizant, is in a way destabilizing. At the same time, I mean, and this is, I think, one of the points of many meditative practices, that if you can see your thoughts, you can see your feelings, you can see your roles and identifications, as from a distance. Well, then what really is you? Because you're not there, are you? Because you're seeing these things, and that, I think, that insight, which I think is available to us all, has something to do with, what some teachers would call the nature of mind, or the true self, or that sort of thing. It's not, so much a rare thing that has to be cultivated, although in a way it does, but it is available, as you say, on a moment-to-moment basis if we're just aware of it. So I think that's very good, and well put, by you. The Sankhya is a very ancient Hindu tradition, and what does it teach? Well, pretty much a great deal what we've just been saying. It's very ancient. It's probably the most ancient, coherent philosophical school that we know of. If you ask even well-informed Hindus and Hindu scholars, so they'll often say it's extinct, but there are still isolated places where it's taught, and it's not extinct, I suppose, if only because we're talking about it and finding some life in it, right here and now. But it's to some degree what later came to be called jnana yoga, the idea that of cultivating awareness and illumination through intellectual speculation, and using that quality of mind as a means of awakening, just as bhakti, devotional yoga, uses emotions. Hatha and karma yoga use the physical body, as and all of these have their own, value and import, but it also happens to be important to use the mind as well.
It's very true, and I wanted to touch on something Erik brought up briefly about that distinction between inner and outer with consciousness and trying to identify yourself in these ancient yogic practices. And I really liked how you point out, you make a really nice thread that relates this ancient philosophy with a lot of more modern psychology and Jung and stuff. And the way you do that is through your discussion between the difference with causality and correspondence. Mm-hmm. Because I think a lot of people will identify themselves not only with their experience, but then you get into how we identify ourselves. If you start to get a little spiritual, then you start to identify yourself with your karma, right? That you have this karma that you get, but then you get into, well, what if you have this only true self? How is it that karma even attaches onto that in distinction from all this other karma? So you kind of make a nice delineation between that. It's not necessarily a cause that's making you be yourself or have this true identity, but it's more, you get into the more correspondence issues of it, which I really like. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little, just the difference between causality and correspondence in terms of how we view ourselves.
Okay. That's it's a very rich topic. For one thing, causation is an extremely mysterious thing. Causation is kind of the primary cement of the universe, as it's sometimes called. But in fact, it's not very well understood. It's also very circularly defined. And one of the greatest analysts of causation was the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who said, I look at all these things that they I call causes, I don't see anything common in them. I don't see, as I do when I see something that's red or a book or so on and so forth. So it must be a relation. So all I'm saying when I say something caused something is I see this kind of thing, what he called as a constant conjunction of events. And that is kind of where we still are. Later philosophers like Kant said, well, in fact, our seeing causes in this way, our capacity of recognizing causation is so integral to the mind that we don't even really understand the universe and aren't capable of understanding the universe without it. And if you see these patterns, let's go back to karma, right? There are patterns. And in the universe, it seems often, particularly in terms of, shall we say, moral acts, that like produces like. A good act produces good effects. Bad acts produce bad effects. And that's what we call karma. Mm-hmm. And you'll notice in many of like the Eastern traditions, the moral is not so much to accumulate good karma, although of course it's better than the opposite, but a freedom from either kind. And the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the central Hindu spiritual texts, kind of proffers selfless action. That is to say, you do what you need to do because it has to be done, and not with any kind of view to the consequences or whether you have any attachment to it or not. And this kind of detachment, which is a little bit different from the kind of kind of isolated pseudo-intellectual detachment that we usually associate with that word, is a way of, shall we say, breaking or loosening the ties of our bondage to our own experience.
Well, and it seems to me also that one of the things that you're setting up here is that there's a connection between the kind of detachment that you're referring to in this karmic situation or the karmic viewpoint and the detachment that comes about through really recognizing this samkhya situation of a pure observer and a whole host of phenomena that is both inside and outside. And one of the things that raises for me is just what you alluded to there, where I think we have a poor idea of detachment, or we're kind of in a bind because we don't have another word. I mean, there's such a difference between the kind of emotionally cold, sense of detachment that we associate with people who don't have a moral sense or who are incapable of experiencing or enjoying life, and this other kind of detachment that is similar in some ways. I mean, it shares characteristics. It's not a different thing exactly, but it has a very different valence. And I think it's a really important thing, and it's also a place that a lot of spiritual practitioners get stuck. On the one hand, people recognize that it's not about, that they don't want to stop living life. In fact, they want to live life even more. And so they kind of avoid things that seem too cold and abstract and intellectual and critical, because that's the world you want to get away from. And on the other hand, you have this sort of confusion where people, adapt or seek these paths of spiritual detachment, but they end up with a kind of cold, unengaged sort of abstraction that doesn't really seem to be where these things ought to be leading. So could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, seems like a really key point in spiritual practice that's tough to navigate.
Yeah, and part of the difficulty lies in its very subtlety. But I think one way you could approach this is by viewing things by the kind of underlying motivation. Now, most detachment, as we kind of, the cold, isolated, unfeeling kind, is motivated to some degree or another out of fear. That is to say, you're walling yourself off from the world as a way of protecting yourself from it. And, that's, essentially a dead end. And there are, all sorts of, the old Simon and Garfunkel song, I am a rock, I am an island, all that sort of thing. Detachment in the more positive, more liberated sense is a freeing oneself of, attachment to results, of even attachment to the self and how you, the greatest fear for many people is how I seem. How do I look to other people? Many people are afraid of more afraid of looking bad than they are of death in some kind of primal way. So I think this is the principal thing with the sense of detachment is not so much an isolation, although it may even look like that at moments, but it's a certain inner freedom, and so you're not hiding out from the world, but you're in the world and performing your actions, shall we say, more cleanly, without hidden agendas or comparatively free from hidden agendas, subtle motivations, that sort of thing. And this needs to be done. And Gurdjieff, who is certainly a great spiritual teacher, spoke of it in terms of doing the work for the work's sake. And I think, at some point, if we're going to really evolve or advance spiritually in a way that's not purely, autistic or navel-gazing, there's some point or another we have to kind of reach that awareness and work toward it.
Yeah, I think one of the things also that is part of the stumbling block is that there hasn't been there isn't very good language around some of the more difficult parts of that process, particularly initially and all along the way where you recognize that one is opening up a kind of isolation. One is, in some sense, asking for a way of being in the world where you can't really take comfort in a lot of the substantial things that we naturally grow up kind of emotionally expecting or hoping, or the way society tells us what we're going to do or what's going to be satisfying or where our satisfaction is going to lie, because once you establish a sense of that basic divide, and it is a divide, at least from some perspectives, between this pure self and this host of phenomenon that you're becoming aware of in a way that somewhat detaches you from it, that you can no longer really put your eggs in that basket, and that is a scary process, and that is in some ways isolating, because it pulls us away from the kind of given stories we have about how we're connected with others, about how we're connected to the world. And it's a funny point, because I really believe like a lot of spiritual practitioners come to the edge of that, and they go, and they have a very different idea of what spirituality is. Spirituality is about being connected. It's about being connected with the world, about being connected with all creation, with other people, emotionally. And that's true too. But there's a point there that's really, I think, an interesting one and tough to navigate. And I appreciate you bringing light on it.
Yeah, you're right. It is a very difficult thing to really elucidate. One thing, however, is that many spiritual teachers and teachings will say that there's an inevitable phase of disillusionment and disappointment. Some would say that you can only really start on a spiritual path when you're truly disappointed, in what the world has to offer. The classic case of like, the midlife, a person in midlife crisis who suddenly, has achieved whatever they've achieved in the last 20 years and realizes that, what is this all about? People can withdraw from or flee from this disillusionment and, various manifestations of, buying a red sports car, deciding your husband is a jerk, or, the usual conventional responses, or facing it in some sort of way and going deeper with it. So, yeah, there has to be a certain amount of, you can no longer quite be fooled, by, what's normally called the diversions and, attachments with the world. It's not so much that you withdraw from them. We're not really in an age where monastic withdrawal seems to be either possible or desirable in the way it was, say, 1,000 years ago. But, kind of an inner liberation from it, to kind of play the game without totally being taken in by the game. And
well, here's one aspect of the Dice Game of Shiva, and you didn't talk as much about this, but I think it's probably also implied in the myth, which is that since Shiva and Parvati start, what are they doing when they start off the tale? They're making love, as they often do, for eons, and it's clear that their love making is also an image of the ongoing, vital, transformative creation of the universe. And it seems that part of that myth is that while there's always a loss in this game, while there's always this sort of divide between the Shiva consciousness and this immense fabric of Parvati, that there is also a model of a proper relation, or maybe the most ethical relation, which is an erotic one, and an erotic one in the most broad, mystical sense of the term, a certain kind of engagement, a certain kind of passion and love that nonetheless sustains and recognizes this polarity or divide. Would you say that would be something, an aspect of the myth as well?
It could be. I mean, I suppose I see that side of it in a slightly different light, in that I sort of view the eternal lovemaking part of it as this kind of ultimate lack of differentiation, where they're so wrapped up in each other that there's no sense of two, and that the we tend to think of as an erotic attraction always involves polarity, and that's more symbolized by that kind of level of the dice game. But that sense of kind of a mystical unity, which is kind of prior to the sense of self and other, is definitely there, and it's something that we long to return to. I think Freud saw this in part in when he wrote about religion and like the future of an illusion. He sort of saw it in the sense of like, well, it's like an infantile thing. The infant doesn't really have a sense of itself as opposed to the world outside it, and all religion is kind of this infantile longing. That longing of kind of oceanic oneness, I think, is valid. I think it's not infantile, but it's kind of the source out of which everything comes, including self and other. As a result, God could be seen as both the source of self and other, and can be viewed both as self and other, which is something that various religions have a great deal of difficulty with.
Well, and I think it's interesting, too, making that distinction between self and other through this kind of relationship with the physical world almost, like how Erik says it is this, erotic physical act that they're doing, and then that kind of keeps them in constant contact with that raw physicality. And I think it's interesting how you said, like, we can't really do this through monastic experience necessarily, in this society. And I just was curious, I know I've read before that you at first kind of struggled with physical practice and involving your physical self in a lot of your, philosophical research, but then that you started getting into some, like, Tibetan movement stuff, like Kumnai and things like that. And I was just curious if you're still practicing that, or if you have like a physical way that for you helps you to come a little bit more into that dialogue.
Yeah, and I suppose as a matter of day-to-day practice. I also, studied Gurdjieff's teaching for a while. I mean, I practiced it. And one aspect of Gurdjieff's self-remembering is to maintain some connection with the sensation of the body at all points. That is to say, so, I'm talking to you, so if I'm doing this, which I sometimes am, sometimes not, I'm aware of, the sensation of my hand on the desk, that kind of thing. That is one form of integration. Kumne, which is, the Tibetan meditation practice that you mentioned, does that. It just does it in a more formalized way. I think that is kind of the way I do it at the moment. I certainly feel even things like fairly conventional forms of exercise, like working out at the gym, helps reinforce that. But I think it's also important to do it in a meditative sense, on a moment-to-moment basis. And we forget. You get wrapped up in a conversation or, your favorite website or whatever you like. But if you keep bringing it back to that sensation, I think that really helps a great deal. I'm talking about it in terms of, the actual sensation of the body, and that's, essential to the Gurdjieff tradition. If you look at it in terms of more Buddhist practice, a lot of times it will be focusing on the sensation of the breath, which is, another way of doing it.
Right.
But I think some kind, that what's called mindfulness in some very broad and often rather vague sense, is definitely integral to that. And it's a way of, kind of stitching the various threads of our being together.
I wanted to go back to this Samkhya approach a little bit and point out one interesting connection, which you allude to a little bit in your book, but has always struck me as being rather significant, is that one of the bad guys in a lot of New Age thinking and new paradigm thinking and holistic thinking is Descartes. And Descartes is attacked because he's a dualist, and he draws this distinction between mind and matter, and there's even a sort of intuitive and in some ways very correct sense that it is with Descartes that we begin a certain strand of Western materialist scientific philosophy that leads to what many people perceive as this crisis that's caused by our detachment from the earth and our et cetera, et cetera. So Descartes also often plays this role as a bad guy with some, with some understandable reasons, I think, even though often kind of incoherent. And yet, if you look at the most significant, or at least most fascinating aspect of his initial meditations, where he clears the ground for the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." Before he makes that statement, which has so many consequences and is itself so problematic, he does something that is remarkably similar to Samkhya. He sits there and he imagines, what if everything, not just the external world, but every passing perception is the work of a demon who is intentionally deluding me? Well, what can withstand that possibility? Any, concept about mathematics or geometry or the existence of the world or the existence of objects, none of that stuff's going to work because it's all part of Prakriti. It's all part of Parvati's veil. But what is left is this sort of awareness. And he makes the decision to say, well, that means I think, therefore I am, and there's all these consequences that come for that I don't think are necessarily, that statement does not necessarily come from that position. But the actual act that he does, this meditation, and it's very clearly a meditation, is so similar in some ways to these philosophies, and yet it's sort of something that this bad guy is going through.
Yeah. Well, I think one aspect of it, and one is that Descartes, for reasons that may not have been totally clear to himself even, did feel the need to validate the Christian God and kind of get back to a validation of the conventional Christian view of God sort of as fast as he could. Another aspect, which is more subtle, is this whole, I suppose the French is je pense donc je suis, I think, therefore I am. Now, there's a subtle difference between at least the way Descartes is usually understood and what, the Sankhya and other traditions like it are saying. It's not so much, when Descartes talks about thinking, you do have a sense that it's kind of this rational discursive mind, that itself kind of proceeds in this kind of linear way, and it's this kind of, we think of as being intellectual in a conventional sense of the term. If you shift that slightly and to say, I am aware, therefore I am, your thoughts are also part of this that you witness. It's the thoughts are not part of the witness, which seems to be what Descartes is kind of getting to, and therefore, everything that goes on in the mind, its contents are kind of contrasted with those of the body, and only sort of kind of contingently related to them. So I think the insight is the same. I guess I would say that his view was, getting taken up so much by this, what we think of as intellect, although it was not always called that. That word used to mean something different. And I think that's one of the key things. And I think it was a subtle thing that started to snowball and have lots of consequences for Western thought over the next 350 years.
Yes, what's funny too is actually at the end of Descartes' life, like he was really sick, and then he wrote this whole manifesto about the role of the soul and kind of like undid a lot of the other stuff he said, but no one published that work, and everyone thought he was crazy, so they didn't look at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's and typically, another case in point is like Thomas Aquinas, who had some kind of mystical experience at the end of his death and sort of, looked at his writings and said, no, I don't know, somehow it all reminds me of straw. But of course that straw is what, both of Aquinas, our worldview, whether no matter what we like to think of ourselves and how we like to think of ourselves, is still very deeply conditioned by both Aquinas and Descartes. There's nothing wrong with coming up with elaborate rational systems as long as they have their place along with everything else. There's always going to be some discrepancy between the thing and your picture of it.
I got a question for you from a somewhat different angle. Just, as I said, I've admired your books a great deal, not just for their content and the information and the arguments you bring, but just for the way that you weave together philosophy, a kind of conversational reflection on matters, an acknowledgement of the validity of spirituality and spiritual traditions. But I'm curious how you feel about this kind of writing in relationship to spiritual topics and to philosophy today. Because when I look at, a lot of the world of people writing about spirituality, so many people feel almost necessary to have like a shtick, to have like a system or something they're speaking for or something that they're arguing for specifically. And there's actually not a lot of room where there's this kind of reflective space where people who take these things seriously nonetheless have a way of expressing them without, kind of like lining up on some team. And I'm curious whether you feel that there's actually a lot of room for that now. Is it a tough road to hoe? Is it something that you feel really called to do in relationship to a lot of other kinds of writing about spirituality?
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up. In short, yeah. I do feel kind of what I'm doing is very different, and and for the reasons you say, the lining up on the team is. There are two aspects of American culture that are, at play here. One is the very fundamental role played by salesmanship in everything. I was wondering the other day why vampires are so big, and I realized, well, this is a perfect symbolic representation of our society, which is, full of creatures after us every second to drain the green blood out of our wallets. So, and in order to sell something, you have to have a shtick, and it's best if you do have it in these handy steps, because Americans love instruction books. It's all, a bunch of recipes, do this, 5 handy tips for doing this or that. And people seem to dig it. You really wonder how many people actually do any of these even very simple things, but reading about them kind of gives them the idea that they're doing something about it. So I think there's that, and also America is probably more than any other nation that I've ever experienced or heard of, very conflicted about the individual versus the collective. I mean, pretty much any work of American literature you can think of, any classic, is about loneliness some way or another. Whether it's, Captain Ahab or Huck Finn or, Gatsby in his mansion, loneliness is a big, big thing. And Americans cope with this by this incredibly cheesy, false collectivism, where, it's sometimes called team spirit. You're all behind, some team, almost regardless. And it's kind of a surrogate and kind of a synthetic and false sense of belonging, but it's something that we kind of want to cultivate in ourselves just to break the isolation. The other thing, too, is that New Age alternative spirituality is very far from immune to the celebrity phenomenon. And, there are these spiritual celebrities out there who supposedly represent some kind of quintessence of attainment. What they're like in their personal lives may be quite another matter, but that's, they're certainly perceived as having, this kind of illumination. If you can kind of follow them, you can kind of, in a way, you can be near them, if you read their things, you can, somehow pick up some of their charisma, as it were, by contagion.
Where do you see hope for something else in our society right now in terms of publications, schools? Do you feel like there is a sort of a contrasting stream that your works and the works of other people we could talk about are a part of? I mean, is there a countervailing trend, or are we just sort of, holding on by our knuckles here?
Well, I guess it's really strong feeling about the culture of large as being kind of at this fin de siècle, this end of the century feeling. And even though in calendar terms the century ended, 10 years ago, it's as if the 21st century hadn't really started yet. For some work thing yesterday, I was looking at these back issues of a magazine. It's called Main Currents in Modern Thought, and it had a lot of cutting-edge ideas in its day, which were in the 70s. But I was struck by how little, this whole discourse has sort of advanced since that time, and that's 35 years ago. It's like, there's still sort of, it's sort of running in place in a way that much of society is running in place. It's the old solutions haven't really worked, but we're still doing them, out of habit, if nothing else. And I think the world of alternative spirituality is in that. Now, cutting against that is the fact that these things that were very esoteric not so long ago have been popularized a great deal, and they have, of necessity, suffered a certain amount of vulgarization, degradation in the process, but I think by and large it's still a positive trend. For example, something like the power of now, or, just the idea that you are not your conditioning, which was 100 years ago, something that might not have been imparted to anyone except under symbolic, terms and some kind of weird initiation. It's now a catchphrase, and if we're, not always quite aware to the extent to which we're conditioning, at least the idea is there.
Well, that's great. We're going to have to end it there, Richard. Thanks so much for this book and for talking to us. Richard Smoley, again, his book, The Dice Game of Shiva, and all his books I heavily recommend. This is Erik Davis here at Expanding Minds. Goodbye to Richard and Maja.
Thank you very much. It was great. Bye-bye.
Bye.